Welcome to Hacking Your Leadership. I'm Chris.
And I'm Lorenzo.
And welcome to this week's Thoughtful Thursday. Don't forget to follow us on YouTube at Hacking Your Leadership and leave us a review on iTunes. On this Thoughtful Thursday, I want to talk about something I saw on LinkedIn that says there is no shame in feeling shame at work. And the reason why I want to talk about this is because this kind of like produced a little anxiety inside me just reading, because I am of the impression that there is far too little shame in a lot of our lives nowadays. The article says, or the message from LinkedIn says, have you ever gotten that message from your boss saying you didn't do something right and it made you want to curl up in a ball and hide? You're not alone. Feeling shame at work is a common emotion that happens to the best of us, and it can be crippling. There's a way to turn that feeling of defeat and anxiety into a positive life lesson. Shame can inspire you to change for the better. And there's a whole article linked to it. But I want to talk about this because I think there's a big difference between feeling shame and being shamed. And I think there are a lot of people out there who don't necessarily know that there is a difference, and especially when it comes to work. What do you think about this?
Yeah, well, I think it's always important that we define what we're talking about.
Sure.
I know sometimes, we even on the podcast, we've gotten feedback from time to time where it's kind of like people read into an assumption of when we say a word, we may define it a certain way. But for shame is an unpleasant, self-conscious emotion often associated with negative self-evaluation, a motivation to quit, and feelings of pain, exposure, distrust, powerlessness, and worthlessness. So again, there's a lot in there.
Right.
I think of shame more in that element of like negative self-evaluation. That's kind of right.
Self-evaluation.
Right.
Very important there.
Right. And not embarrassment where it's a public thing. Shame is just a self-conscious emotion associated with some of these things. So when I think about shame and shame at work, for me personally, a lot of times that feeling of shame is something where I maybe like didn't put in a full effort into something. Mm-hmm. Maybe I try to cut a corner on something, or I allowed something to kind of like fall off of the map just because I didn't address it in the moment. I didn't make a strategy behind it. Like for me, the shame part is like negative self-evaluation of like, man, I know I could have been better. I definitely could have done better. And I definitely shouldn't have, had this been such an issue in regards to like allowing me to not show up the way that I know I could show up. So it's like, for me, that's what it's about. And I kind of like, I want to hear more about your thoughts on this, on like the shame versus being shamed, because I think that there's definitely some elements of shame personally that are helpful for me to make sure that I'm constantly doing a good job.
Right. So if I were to come across a car accident where people were trapped in a car and I had to spring into action and try to pull people out of a car before it exploded, and I got 2 of the 3 people out and 1 person I didn't, I would feel tremendous sadness for that person, for their family. I wouldn't feel shame. I wouldn't feel like I cut a corner, or I could have or should have done differently or better. It would disappointment, I guess. I wanted it. I would have loved to be able to save everybody. Shame is about being able to look back on whatever it was that you did and think, you know what, if I had made different decisions that maybe my inner voice was telling me to make in the moment, and I said, shut up, inner voice, I'm doing it this way instead, that if later on I can say, yeah, I should have listened to that inner voice, that's where the shame comes from. It comes from this idea that I should have done differently and I should have known better. And so if I get that email, as the article says, the email from my boss saying I didn't do something right, and it made me want to curl up in a ball, the only reason that would ever happen to me is if when that email came through, I'm reading it, and as soon as the ping comes through, I go, I bet I know what that's about. And if I already know what that's about, that means, it means I know I should have done it differently. I should have done things differently, and I chose not to. I chose to take the easy way or cut the corner or whatever it is, and now I'm being called out, and that's where that sense of shame comes from. Now, does that mean that my boss has shamed me? Heck no. No, it could mean that. It could mean that if the email from the boss says, "What the hell were you thinking, you idiot?" that is the boss shaming me, and that should never, ever, ever happen. You should never be shaming a person at work. If a person feels shame, that doesn't mean that they have been shamed. If a person feels shame and it is self-imposed because they can look back on that inner voice and say, you know what, I should have listened to that inner voice. I should have done things differently, and I didn't, and now I'm feeling the shame because of it. That's not a negative thing. Shame that we impose on ourselves is a way to not make the same mistake or the same decision next time. It's the reason why we will be more likely to listen to that inner voice later on, the next time it happens, as opposed to just kind of putting it aside and saying, no, I'm gonna do what I want. So I don't think that's a bad thing. Shame isn't a bad thing, but being shamed is a bad thing, especially if you're in a leadership position. You should not be shaming your employees. So what I want to ask you, Lorenzo, is, have you ever felt shame about something that was not just self-imposed, but that was imposed on you by a leader who was actually shaming you? And how did you react to it in the moment? How did you get through it? And did you have a conversation with that person? So I want to ask you that, but first I want to give a word from one of our sponsors. All right, Lorenzo, has a boss or a leader ever given you feedback in a way where you could tell they were intentionally trying to absolutely shame you because of something that you did? And how did you react?
Yes. I think it's happened throughout my career. I think less and less and less as I have continued to just shape and build my own confidence and have my own voice in places. But I remember early on working for a leader where I made a decision on a strategy that in the short term did not have the results that we were kind of looking for. Like one of those times, like, hey, I'm going to try this out. I think this is going to work. I feel really good about it. And in the short term, in the strategy was what I would say, like one of those where not necessarily supported by that leader, like not the way that they would want to do things.
Right.
So it was very much a different way of doing things. And I did it. And in the short term, it wasn't going well. And in the meeting in the short term, that leader kind of called me out in a way that says like, hey, like, Lorenzo, do you want to give us an update, on the strategy, or maybe you don't, based upon the results so far?
Yeah, the passive aggressive.
I
know the answer. I know the answer to the question already, but I'm going to ask it anyway because I want you to feel the shame of having to answer the question that I already know the answer to.
Correct, and yes, and kind of that type of thing. And my response at the time was probably a little bit bitey as well. And I was like, I always love to talk about our strategies and our people and the hard work that we're doing, and my confidence in having this outcome be something that we're going to be celebrating in a few weeks from now. So it was very much like a little bit of back and forth. And again, I would not necessarily recommend that people have that same energy. My situation was such that I knew that I had support from other people in a way that I could have that level of confidence and dialogue. But it sure as heck didn't feel good. And it didn't feel like a healthy, inspirational type of environment, one that other leaders had provided for me. One that other leaders would want to talk about it, but also share about like, well, what are we learning, and like, what are we thinking, and how do we feel about this, or like that type of situation. So I remember how it felt. I really, I don't know. For me, it was probably one of those moments where I continue to think about that throughout my career of not making people feel that way, or of actually just sharing with people up front that it's okay to make mistakes, that we know some strategies are going to be longer term, and that do we expect an immediate increase in whatever we're measuring, or is this something that's more of a long term? And let's be prepared for that. And how do we think about that? So again, I just I love that you called it out this way, and we're talking about the idea of that there is an element of shame that I think is good. I mean, obviously with everything, there is something that can be debilitating if somebody who just is always feeling shameful, or has grown up or lived a life of being shamed where it's hard for them to break out of it or to find any good in it. But I think in the context of this article and what we're talking about from a self-development standpoint, there are some times that you should be checking yourself, and you should be saying like, you know what? Yes, I know I could have done that differently. I could have done that better, and I deserve to feel a little bit like I let myself down in outputting the best that I could output.
I think a lot of people, they attempt to shame others because they believe that those people will not self-impose that shame to begin with. That without their leadership imposing the shame, that there will be no learning. And that's one of the most short-sighted things I can think of. There is no learning that comes from being shamed. All there is defensiveness and how do I avoid this feeling? But it's not how do I avoid this feeling by doing better. It's how do I avoid this feeling by avoiding this person, by making sure I don't interact with this person anymore. And that's how you get people that don't have good relationships with their leaders and they end up leaving organizations. So yeah, this is if a person is not feeling a sense of self-imposed shame when it comes to doing something that they cut a corner, they didn't do things right, there's a process for holding them accountable, and it's whatever your organization says that process is. And it needs to be something that is done methodically and without emotion, and it needs to be kind of matter of fact. You have the conversation and you move forward with it. And if they take that to find a way to make changes, then that's great. And if they don't, then maybe they're not right for the organization. But it is not your role as a leader to try to kind of emotionally manipulate them into doing better by chastising them or otherwise trying to call them out in a way that makes them feel embarrassed about their performance. Either they already feel that way or they don't. And if they don't already feel that way, they're not the right person for the organization. If they do already feel that way, then there's nothing that you need to do besides help them through it the next time and offer your support, because maybe their failure, maybe the reason why they did something incorrectly or why they're feeling shame is something that could have been mitigated had you reached out to begin with and said, hey, how can I help with this? How can I take something off your plate? How can I alleviate the stress of whatever you have going on this day that might make it more likely for you to accomplish the things you have to get done? And so if your people are failing, start with thinking, how did you fail as the leader, as opposed to thinking, how can I shame them for failing?
Yep, that's a great point. And with that, it brings us to the end of this episode. This is Hacking Your Leadership. I'm Lorenzo.
And I'm Chris.
And we'll talk to you all next time.